Hey everyone, Mulligan here, and welcome to the Argenport portion of my legendary crafting guide. As always, if you're new to the game or just getting into constructed, you're probably wondering what legendaries you need to craft first. This series is aimed towards answering that question for you. Because of that, each video will focus on a single two-color faction. I try to be as informative as possible with the cards I talk about, since I feel that going fairly in depth and giving a little history on how they've been used in different metagames will help you guys just starting out that want to focus on crafting legendaries for a particular deck. Argenport is a bit less established than the other factions, but the faction has started to find its legs in recent weeks. Despite that, this video will actually be even looser than the Hooru guide. I'll just be talking about essential legendaries, which you should always craft first. But instead of optional legendaries, I'm going to have a section where I talk about legendaries that you should not craft, but you should keep an eye on instead. I'll still mention what decks the essential legendaries on this list typically find a home in though. Any legendary I don't mention is either highly experimental, doesn't fit the general game plan of a particular deck, or is just plain bad. Let's get into it. Starting off with the essential legendaries, we have two on this list. Those are Bartholo the Seducer and Inquisitor Makdo. Let's talk about Bartholo first. He's a 3-power 2/2 unit requiring 2 Justice and 1 Shadow Influence to play. He has Unblockable and Aegis, and an ultimate where you pay 10 to draw a relic of your choice from your deck. This is in contention for one of the most hated legendaries in Omens of the Past. I'd say it is fairly close to Sandstorm Titan levels of hatred, just to give an idea. It's obvious why. Bartholo is a unit that you can't trade card for card against by traditional means. It's taken a while, but Bartholo has found his way into Argenport mid-range decks and, more recently, Argenport aggro decks. Since those two are the only two Argenport decks that have gained some ground at this time, Bartholo is pretty essential to craft, and both decks never leave home without 4 copies of the card. So that's the recommended amount to craft. Next, let's talk about Inquisitor Makdo, a 5-power 5/5 unit requiring 2 Justice and 2 Shadow Influence to play. He has Flying and Revenge, and Makdo's Revenge never ends. One of the most hyped cards in Omens of the Past during spoiler season. Some have said Makdo turned out to be overhyped, but I think the hype was justified for the most part. This is just a solid 5-drop unit for Argenport, and there really isn't that much competition for Makdo at that cost. While you don't necessarily need him in an Argenport aggro deck, Makdo is a must for Argenport mid-range strategies, and he even finds a home in more experimental 3-color decks like Justice Primal Shadow Control. I've personally gotten away with running 3 copies in a given deck, but I'm going to recommend that you craft 4 copies of this one as well. You'll want to have them around in general. So the rest of the cards on this list will be cards that you should not craft for Argenport, but instead just keep an eye on them, as the cards do have the potential to find their way into viable decks if the metagame, depending upon how the metagame changes. So the first two I want to talk about are Leave a Witness and Sword of the Sky King. Let's look at Leave a Witness first. This is a 7-power spell requiring 3 Justice Influence to play. You kill all units, and it has Mentor, where you spare the student. Those of you who have watched my previous videos where I mentioned this card are going to notice a pattern. Just like in those videos, Leave a Witness once again likely plays the role of a 5th copy of Arch Rule for those Argenport decks that do run said card, at least theoretically. I wouldn't craft this for any of your Justice Shadow decks at all though, despite me saying that. I'd wait and see if an Argenport deck breaks into the meta that does utilize this card. Next, let's talk about Sword of the Sky King, an 8-power 8/8 relic weapon requiring 2 Justice Influence to play. And the pattern continues with this card as well. If a control deck sporting Justice and Shadow cards becomes popular, there is a possibility that this could sneak its way into that deck. Sword of the Sky King is a decent finisher in slower decks, especially if there aren't a ton of late game win conditions that you have access to. Argenport in theory has a few, and I'm even going to mention more of them in this section, but by no means is the faction in abundance of those win conditions. Same deal as Leave a Witness. I would not craft this for Argenport at all, but I would keep an eye on it just in case said control deck running Justice and Shadow does break into the metagame. The next 2 cards I want to talk about are Vara Fate Touched and The Last Word. So let's touch on Vara first. She's an 8 power 6/6 unit requiring 3 Shadow Influence to play. She has Deadly. When you play a Shadow unit, including Vara, play an additional Shadow unit from your Void. The best Scion in the game shows up once again. Vara, in my opinion, actually has a bit more potential in slower Argenport decks than the previous 2 cards I mentioned. And I think she is more likely to show up in a control build sporting Justice and Shadow cards. Every deck runs units. Vara does have problems though. Anti-synergy with Inquisitor Makto is unfortunate, but the bigger issue is that sometimes when you play Vara in control decks, you might not get enough value from the units in your Void because you just don't run as many as an aggro or mid-range deck would. And sometimes you don't have any units in your Void at all. I wouldn't craft her if you're trying to get into Argenport, but keep tabs on Vara if a control deck in the faction becomes viable. So next, let's talk about the Last Word. This is a 9 power 1/1 relic weapon requiring 3 Shadow Influence to play. It has Deadly and Quick Draw, and an ultimate where you pay 9 to make the Last Word's attacks deadly to players. Yet another late game option that could theoretically be used in a late game control build sporting Justice and Shadow cards. I've personally never tried this card in my early testing with Justice Primal Shadow control, though it's a possible fit since Shadow is typically the most important faction in that deck. No faster Argenport deck would want this though. Again, I would hold out on crafting this and wait to see how the metagame develops. Finally, let's talk about what is definitely going to be the most controversial card on this list. And that is Grinva, Judge of Battles. So this is a 7 power 7/9 unit requiring 3 Justice and 3 Shadow Influence to play. When one of your other units dies, Grinva deals that unit's strength and damage to the enemy player. People are going to wonder why I put Grinva on this list. I will say, she almost didn't make it in here. Her effect is pretty powerful, and her stat line is excellent for a 7-drop. However, her effect is also pretty slow. It can take a long time to get the value you need off of her, and she will likely die before that happens. But this is a classic case of a card that reads, kill me quick or lose the game. I think Grinva is probably going to fit best into a mid-range / control build that features a lot of good units that have revenge and isn't afraid to harsh rule if needed. We are pretty far from a deck like that with the current card pool though, at least in my opinion. Granted, there could be other decks completely off the wall that she might work in. Like the others in this section, I wouldn't craft Grinva at all right now. I would keep an eye on her, but Grinva needs a lot of help to be viable. That's it for the Argenport portion of the Legendary Crafting Guide. If you're just starting out, let me know if these videos have been helpful to you. Hopefully I've pointed you guys in the right direction. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like. If you have any suggestions or just general feedback, let me know in the comments section below. Also, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the future videos, not just for this series, but for the other Eternal content I put out as well. And thanks for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.